On 17 March 2018, two CP train crews were ordered at approximately 2300 hours. The first crew was scheduled to operate westbound train 651 from Toronto Yard at mile 197.0 of the Belleville subdivision to London, Ontario at mile 114.6 of the Galt subdivision. Train 651 departed Toronto Yard via Main Track 2 at about 0040 hours on 18 March 2018. It consisted of a head-end locomotive, 2 loaded buffer cars, and 92 empty residue tank cars. The train weighed about 3,600 tons and was about 5,840 feet long. The crew consisted of a locomotive engineer and a conductor who were qualified for their positions, met fitness and rest requirements, and were familiar with the territory. The second train crew was scheduled to operate westbound train 141, also destined for London. Train 141 departed Toronto Yard via Main Track 2 at about 0050 hours on 18 March 2018. Train 141 consisted of 2 locomotives, 57 loaded cars, and 87 empty cars. It weighed about 10,700 tons and was about 8,450 feet long. The crew consisted of an LE and a conductor who were qualified for their positions, met fitness and rest requirements, and were familiar with the territory. At about 0105 on 18 March 2018, train 651 stopped with its head end at Dovercourt Road, Toronto, Ontario, in view of approach signal 45-2, indicating clear to stop for a meet with an eastbound freight train. Train 651 was occupying track 2 over 4 grade separated road crossings, including Howland Avenue, mile 3.48 of the North Toronto subdivision, about 4,700 feet from the head end. At approximately 0110, the eastbound train arrived. At about 0115, train 651 received a permissive signal and started to depart. Shortly after 0115, 2 teenage girls who lived in the area were walking south on Howland Avenue and observed train 651 slowly moving westward. They climbed the embankment immediately northwest of the Howland Avenue overpass and entered onto the railway right-of-way without authority through a gap between the fencing and the overpass barrier. The teenagers were intoxicated, climbed onto the train intending to travel to the nearby Christie Street grade separated crossing, located some 2,600 feet west of the Howland Avenue grade separated crossing, on their way to Christie Pitts Park. Approaching the train, the 2 teenagers climbed onto a tank car positioned near the tail end of the train by climbing the side ladder to reach the platform on top of the car, where the manway is located. The crew members on train 651 were unaware of the teenagers' presence and continued proceeding westward. By the time the train arrived at the Christie Street grade separated crossing, the train had reached a speed at which the teenagers believed they would not be able to disembark safely. They remained on top of the tank car as the train continued to accelerate, reaching a speed of about 50 miles per hour, or track speed. By this point, the teenagers were starting to feel very cold and were getting anxious, particularly when they traversed the high railway bridge over the Etobicoke Creek at mile 11.7 of the Galt subdivision. They called 911 in an attempt to have the train stop. The Toronto Police Service received a call from a female indicating that she was on top of a moving train. However, the phone connection was lost before all the details were received. The calls to 911 were therefore unsuccessful. A trace of the number placed the phone in the vicinity of Wolfdale Road. Train 651 began to ascend a long grade at mile 13 of the Galt subdivision. As the train began to decelerate, the teenagers made their way down the north side ladder of the tank car. At about 0140, approaching the Wolfdale Road crossing, mile 16.82, approximately 20 miles from where they had got on, the train was proceeding at about 20 miles per hour. Believing that the train had decelerated sufficiently, the teenagers jumped from the car while at the Wolfdale Road crossing. The first jumped off the tank car onto the pavement and rubberized crossing material. The second followed, jumping off at the west end of the crossing and rolling onto the ballast between tracks 1 and 2. Both teenagers sustained injuries when they hit the ground. One was mobile and left to seek assistance. However, the other sustained more serious injuries and was temporarily immobilized, remaining on the right-of-way. Shortly thereafter, at about 0150, the following train, train 141, was approaching the Wolfdale Road crossing at 23 miles per hour with the bell sounding. The crew members noticed what they perceived to be an object next to the north rail of track 2, just beyond the crossing. As the train proceeded over the Wolfdale Road crossing, the second teenager, who was disoriented, stood up and began to walk southward in a crouched position across track 2 into the path of the oncoming train. It was at that time that the crew members realized what they had seen beside the north rail was actually a person. The lead engineer immediately initiated an emergency brake application and sounded the whistle. Train 141 could not stop in time and struck the teenager, who was now positioned near the south rail of track 2. She landed against the north rail of track 3, sustaining additional serious injuries. After train 141 came to a stop, the crew members alerted the rail traffic controller, who contacted first responders. Both teenagers were taken to hospital for treatment. At the time of the occurrence, it was dark. The temperature was minus 5 degrees Celsius. Subdivision and the wind and track from the information at 8 kilometers an hour, proceeding from Toronto to London, operate on 3 subdivisions: Belleville, North Toronto, and Galt, and traverse one of the most populated areas in Canada. These trains initially depart Toronto Yard at mile 197.0 of the Belleville subdivision and proceed west for 9 miles, where they enter the North Toronto subdivision. Traveling on the North Toronto subdivision from mile 0.0 to mile 5.9, the trains enter onto the Galt subdivision at mile 4.9. The Galt subdivision extends to mile 114.6 at London. Train operations on the Belleville and North Toronto subdivisions, as well as in the occurrence area on the Galt subdivision, are governed by the Centralized Traffic Control System, as authorized by the Canadian Rail Operating Rules, and supervised by a CPRTC located in Calgary, Alberta. At the Howland Avenue in Toronto, the North Toronto subdivision is double main track, tracks 1 and 2, with a spur track running parallel and north of track 2. The minimum train speed through this area is 50 miles per hour. At Wolfdale Road in Mississauga, the Galt subdivision has 3 parallel main tracks with an east to west orientation. The tracks are numbered 1, 2, and 3, with track 1 being the northernmost track. In the vicinity of the Wolfdale Road crossing, the authorized speed limit for freight trains was 60 miles per hour. However, due to an ascending westward grade extending from mile 13 to mile 16.82, westbound freight trains would operate through this area at much slower speeds, depending on their weight and length. Trespassing at Howland Avenue. In the vicinity of the Howland Avenue grade separated crossing, trespassing on railway property was a common occurrence. The underpass provides road and pedestrian access to the DuPont Street business section for residents living north of the tracks. It was common for individuals to cross the tracks and/or walk along the railway right-of-way using the old roadbed adjacent to the tracks on the south side. Train crews had become accustomed to seeing people trespassing at this location on a regular basis. However, unless the people trespassing were obstructing or interfering with railway operations, the train crews did not normally report them to the RTC. When trespassing activity was reported, the RTC relayed the information to the CP Police Service, who would follow up by either visiting the site or contacting local police. CP continuously monitors and replaces no trespassing signs as they are removed and new trespassing locations are identified. Being aware of trespassing activity at this location in 2014, CP added approximately 4,500 feet of new fencing and continuously repaired identified holes in the fencing. CP had erected several no trespassing signs at identified access points. These signs had initially been installed on the fencing. However, they were often removed or vandalized. To prevent further tampering, it was decided to install the no trespassing signs on a signal bungalow positioned along the railway right-of-way next to the tracks, about 45 feet from the access point. The gap between the fencing and the overpass barrier. The writing on the warning signs on the signal bungalow could not be easily read from the areas where people would normally access the tracks, although several well-worn pathways were noticeable in the vicinity. No additional barriers had been erected to deter trespassing. During site observations following the occurrence, it was noted that a worn pathway extended from the parking lot northwest of Howland Avenue up the embankment and through a gap between the fencing and the overpass barrier where the teenagers had accessed the right-of-way. Several access points were present on the south side of the right-of-way through broken fencing and up the embankment. The gap between the fencing and the overpass barrier on the north side was wide enough to accommodate a person without significant effort. There was no indication of any pre-existing barrier to prevent trespassing through this gap, and a number of individuals were present on railway property during the site visit. No trespassing signs were posted on the signal bungalow located immediately south of Track 1. Graffiti was present on the signal bungalow, but did not cover the signage. An old roadbed running parallel and south of Track 1 extended from Yonge Street to Bartlett Avenue, about 2.5 miles. The roadbed had become a regular pathway by which people would access the railway right-of-way without authority. Risk perception by individuals trespassing. Individuals who repeatedly experience either directly or indirectly by observing others a dangerous activity or environment without negative repercussions may not appreciate the actual level of associated risk. Without mitigation in place to inform and calibrate risk perception, the subjective evaluation of a low personal risk may lead people to perform more high-risk activities. The perception of risk can decrease further than higher risk decisions become normal and accepted within a given group. All acts of trespassing on railway property carry risk. The teenagers involved in this occurrence had regularly observed people walking their dogs on railway property on the old roadbed alongside the railway in the vicinity of the Howland Avenue grade-separated crossing. In this occurrence, however, crossing tracks and climbing onto moving railway equipment is a much higher risk activity. The teenagers had never previously observed people climbing onto moving equipment. The conspicuity of a warning sign refers to how well it can capture the attention of an observer who does not necessarily expect it to be present. In this occurrence, the only no trespassing signs were those affixed to the signal bungalow immediately south of Track 1. These warnings were red and white, which were also the colors of some of the graffiti on the signal bungalow. The limited visual contrast between the no trespassing signs and the graffiti reduce the conspicuity of the signs, making it less likely that people would see and read them. The level of conspicuity, which was already low, would have been even more limited in darkness. The teenagers involved in this occurrence were not aware of the posted no trespassing signs. Decision making. Decision making process in teenagers. Typically, teenagers differ from adults in the way they behave and how they make decisions due to the neurobiological, social, and emotional factors that change over a person's lifespan. For example, teenagers score higher than adults on measures of impulsivity and sensation seeking. Peak levels in those areas occur during adolescence. Teenagers are also more sensitive than adults to the potentially rewarding consequences of behavior, and their judgment is more strongly influenced by factors such as the presence or absence of peers. Teenagers' decision-making processes may similarly influence their judgment and decision-making regarding railway safety behavior, making them more likely than adults to take risks on railway property by trespassing. Effects of psychoactive substances on decision-making. An individual's psychological state will also affect their decision-making and propensity to take risks. Psychoactive substances such as drugs and alcohol are important contributors to this state. In the hours before this occurrence, the teenagers had taken non-prescription alprazolam and psilocybin. The effects of these substances were still present when they decided to climb onto the train. Alprazolam, also known as Xanax, is a benzodiazepine prescription medication used to treat anxiety and panic attacks. Benzodiazepines are depressants that slow down brain activity, producing a drowsy or calming effect. Problematic use of benzodiazepines can cause substance use disorder overdose and death. Common short-term effects of benzodiazepines include dizziness, confusion, drowsiness, muscle weakness, and loss of coordination and balance. Alprazolam is also available as a street drug in Canada and is used among teenagers. Psilocybin is a hallucinogen found in certain species of mushroom. Side effects of ingesting mushrooms containing psilocybin include seeing, hearing, or feeling things that are not really there. Users may also experience anxiety, nausea, and muscle twitches. Other negative mental effects include lightheadedness, loss of coordination, confusion, and disorientation. Intoxication from ingesting psychoactive substances is strongly related to disinhibition and impulsive behavior. In experimental research studies, alprazolam in humans increases their risky decision-making, depending on the dose.